listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, the place to learn about new technology and technological advances before they become mainstream. This podcast is sponsored by Ingram Micro's Imagine Next. It's not about the destination. It's about going someplace you never thought possible. Go to imaginenext.ingrammicro.com to find out more. Let's get into it.
Welcome to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro. I'm your host, Keri Roberts, and my guest today is Allie Ashdown, an event services manager at Ingram Micro. Welcome, Allie. Thank you for being here today.
Hi, Keri. Thanks for having me.
So we're chatting about corporate events today, something that's on a lot of people's minds, especially during this whole pandemic. Can you share with us a little bit about how you personally got into this corporate event space? And what do you think makes a great corporate event planner, especially in 2020?
Absolutely. So I actually got into events by chance, like many of us probably do. I was working a part-time job in college, and I just took it. It was just something to do. But I fell in love with the constant change from event to event. I think the really fun part about working in corporate events is that no two events are alike. I found really quickly that every project that was coming through had such different needs, and it felt like such a different experience from start to finish. And it's always nice when working on projects when you do have a finish. That feeling of throwing your badge in the trash can at the end of the day or at the end of a conference or an event is a really good feeling when it's all said and done. In terms of what makes a great corporate event planner in 2020, I think the funny thing is it doesn't change from 2019 to 2020. The same qualities that you needed pre-pandemic are necessary during a pandemic. The events industry is full of surprises, and a great planner really has to have adaptability, flexibility, and a consultative mindset. And of course, great attention to detail because there's so many different moving parts happening at an event. So it's really been really amazing actually watching our corporate events team embody those qualities throughout the pandemic, because you find that you're actually using your skills in a new way in 2020, but applying all the same principles. We have a lot of talent.
And Ingram Micro did almost 800 events last year. And that's kind of a combination between the large events you do, like one, which is coming up in November, to small in-office events, to things like happy hours. And then during COVID, just like many other organizations and event planners, you had to, of course, reorganize to become all digital. How did you help Ingram make that shift from live to virtual?
Yeah, 2020 has been quite the journey for our corporate events team, and I'm sure a lot of people in the industry will feel the same. We're really lucky that we had the opportunity to keep doing events, but the first huge challenge that we had ahead of us when all this hit in March was that news that you get where they say, you're not going to be meeting face-to-face in 2020. And when that's your career, is to organize things, meetings or happy hours or big conferences that require face-to-face meeting and travel. That's a pretty scary statement. And the first priority for us was really, okay, well, we have X number of events that are currently planned that we're contracted into. What are we going to do about those events? How can we cancel or reschedule those events with as little repercussion as possible financially? And we actually were able to reschedule or cancel over 100 events, which was a huge win for our team. It took a lot of work. You really have to know your contracts, and hopefully you've had built relationships with the people that you've been negotiating with. And if you have a legal team as an event planner, then it's really important to consult with them as well on that. But that was a huge, important step when March hit. That was our first priority. Funny enough, our next step was we had to really think through. Well, once we finished that, we kind of got to April, and we had to think through, okay, well, now what are we going to do? We can't meet face to face. We've rescheduled and we've canceled all of these events. Now, what is our team of 13 people going to do? And so, yeah, we had to move to virtual and make that shift. And I can say now we're really proud that comparatively to that 800 in-person events last year, we've now done 600 events in 2020, and 500 of those were virtual. So it's a pretty big win and a big shift that we made.
500 are virtual. I mean, that seems like so much. It sounds like you were doing an event like every day, maybe twice a day. Like
Yes.
How often is this happening, especially, during all of this? What did you find worked and didn't work well? Was it to do something every day, or can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, people don't want to do events on Mondays or Fridays typically with these virtual events. So our our Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays are really busy days during the week. And yes, we do have, as an agency, we have some days 10 events going on in a day. Like I said, we have about 13 planners. So, they're locked and loaded with events every single day of the week, other than typically Mondays and Fridays. And to get to that point, we had to really think about, how are we going to translate what we used to do in person to a virtual environment? What does that look like? What mattered? Why were we meeting in person? And how can we translate that why to a virtual environment? And what does that entail? I mean, where do you even begin with a virtual experience? But piece by piece, we kind of brainstormed all of those different types of events that we did in person, whether it's a happy hour or a dinner or a conference or a meeting. And then we came up with virtual alternatives. So how can we translate that, each individual, because even those different types of in-person events, they have different goals. So we really wanted to think through the big picture of why we were doing what we were doing. And the first few months were really intense. We were kind of figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And I think what we were finding that people were loving the most was that connection. When the pandemic first hit, and especially when everyone was ultra quarantined with, their stacks of toilet paper in their house, which I didn't manage to get any, but when they were sitting there, you're feeling really disconnected. You don't get to see people. You're wondering, what's going to happen next. It's kind of a gloomy time. And so it was really a priority for us to lift up the people who are attending our events and connect our partners and our customers and our associates in a way that they were missing, that human connection. So we found out quickly what didn't work, which is really large groups. Large groups on a virtual setting just don't translate well, because naturally you're going to have 4 or 5 people who do most of the talking, and then the rest have their cameras off, they're on mute, and they're not really they're listening, but they're not really wanting to butt in. So you're always going to have kind of the more outspoken characters and the quieter characters. And it's not like in person where you can, at an event where you can just grab someone and have a side chat. Events are full of side chats, and most business is done in side chats. So that's been a really hard thing to replace. But keeping the experiences to groups of less than 30 people has been a sweet spot for us in terms of engagement and intimacy. And if you do want to do a larger event, that's, there's great options for that too, and ways to do it. But we would recommend more pre-recorded general session presentations, followed by smaller breakout groups. On-demand content also goes down really well for larger groups where they can watch it in their own time, but have maybe a social element with a smaller group at a later time. So those are the big things that kind of crossed my mind. And I think also attention span is, I don't know if you've had to sit in a 2-hour Zoom or Teams meeting, but people struggle with that, and there's a lot of distraction. We become little squirrels with our text messages or emails popping up and Teams chats coming through. So you have to be really careful about how long you're doing these events for. So we like that 1 hour mark. We don't really like to go beyond an hour a day in an event, quote unquote, event setting online, because we find that anything more is actually kind of leads to boredom or burnout. So that's another big one to consider.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you're saying. And, I think one of the problems or one of the things that organizations are concerned about is we're always trying to reach more people. We've had events for thousands and thousands of people, and now you're saying, it's best to do it in groups of 30. So some people may think like, oh my gosh, that's so much more work now. So I'm curious, how has virtual events allowed you to reach more people while still keeping this kind of, intimate setting that you're talking about? And have you noticed different types of people attending your events as well?
Yeah, it's funny. And you do need that. And you can reach, thousands of people, but I wouldn't do it in a setting where they can talk to each other. Because again, you can't have 1,000 people on a Zoom call all trying to talk at the same time. It just doesn't work. But in terms of, the demographic or the number of people, it's actually been really interesting. We've seen an increase in attendance for certain types of events. We actually just looked into this really recently. We looked at our 2019 data and our 2020 data for our virtual experiences. And we saw that when there's content attached and there's a meeting, the attendance has doubled. So if we had 50 people attend before, we were having 100 people. If it was 100, it was 200. So content wise, people are drawn to that in a virtual environment.
What do you mean when you say that before it wasn't content? What's the difference?
Well, so say it was a meeting where you would have gotten on an airplane, gone to a different city, and attended some type of training. And it was an intimate training. It might have been a training for 50 of that client's, you're an important customer. They work hard to recruit those 50 people. In this case now, for the same content that they were sharing at those in-person meetings where they're saying, hey, come to Napa Valley and we're going to do all this training. We're going to have some nice wine and it's going to be really great. We're enticing you here to do this. It would still be, it's a tough draw to get people to get on an airplane, time away from their family, time away from their desk. And so I would say that and what I'm seeing in recruitment for those types of in-person events, I'm seeing that for the same content where they're doing these, where we translated it to a virtual environment, we're getting double the people signing up. It's been far, and in terms of the people who actually show up too, it's been a huge increase, a double increase. But again, the focus for those is content with a touch of networking. On the flip side, things like happy hours, we're seeing a decrease. Probably about half of the people want to attend a virtual happy hour compared to an in-person happy hour. There's just certain things that translate a lot better than others. You can only sit on Zoom with a cocktail so many times before it's, the novelty wears off. Compared to an in-person happy hour, you might, you're in a different bar each time or a different restaurant or just a different cool location for that. And, like I said, you can have those side chats. You can't have side chats in a virtual environment. That's kind of taken away from us. But one thing that I would say as a carrot for those people that does help those happy hours go a lot better is making them more interactive. So things like having a cocktail making class where you have a bartender and you're making, gin-based drinks, and he's teaching you how to do all these different gin-based drinks, or a wine tasting with a sommelier, or a craft beer tasting. So they've got all their different beers, and they've got a guide from a brewery that's taking them through and talking them through all of the different things that they're tasting. Those go down a lot better than just here's some alcohol, join us on Zoom and talk. I think there needs to be an activity, and it really does make a huge difference. It makes it feel so much more interactive.
Yes. Again, I agree with you. I think the activity kind of makes an event stand out. You were mentioning earlier that you noticed in kind of your data that it's better to do an event Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Are you noticing a time of day that seems to work best for people?
We had to get to a point where we're like, okay, I think we need to push back those happy hour style events. Anytime there's alcohol involved, it needs to be much later in the day because people don't want companies don't want their associates drinking during the day, right? And you don't want to be drinking during the day necessarily because you've got work to do. So it makes it a lot more fun if you make sure that you're having these kind of as the day ends. I see a lot of these going around 4:00. And what we ended up doing is actually changing so that there would be multiple options. So you could join depending on what coast you're on. You could make sure that you're joining the appropriate time so that you're not getting served cocktails at, midday, 12:00 in the afternoon with your lunch.
So you're talking about different timings and different days and different types of content as well. Does somebody have to sign up for a webinar or sign up for an event, or are you doing any that are like free on your LinkedIn page or Facebook page or things of that nature?
No, yeah, we don't do any on LinkedIn or Facebook or anything like that. In terms of cost, it definitely varies on the event. In some cases, our events are sponsored often. So when people are invited, there might not be a cost associated because that's already covered by the sponsor or the company that's hosting with us. But yes, they do have to register because otherwise we wouldn't be able to get them the materials that they need for the event. So we always have a registration website for our events.
Now, as we start to move to more face-to-face events, what are the steps that you see the industry taking as a whole? Will we be seeing things that are more hybrid, or do you think we'll go back to kind of how we were before?
Yeah, as we ease into 2021, I think we can definitely see a thoughtful re-entry to in-person meetings. Hybrid events are the first step for large format events, in my opinion. I think we'll see reduced in-person attendance or even pockets of attendance. So you might have 20 people attending in Scottsdale, 20 people attending in Chicago, and 20 people in South Carolina, and 20 in Texas, and kind of basically smaller events that are all happening at the same time and have the same content, but you're making it so that people don't have to get on an airplane. And anything that's happening, any of the general session would then be broadcast. So it would go to each location. And that way you could attend in person and be able to experience some type of social distance networking somewhere close to you where you don't have to get on an airplane. But you could also attend from home because everything would be broadcast and recorded. It could be live, but the way that the content is presented would be different depending on whether you're in person or if you are attending on your computer at home. So that's a huge thing that we're looking into as a team is what do you take into account for these two different experiences that are going to be happening together at the same time. So it's kind of like a sporting event. The attendees who go to the game in person receive a completely different experience to those who are watching at home, or when you watch the Emmys or the Oscars or anything live on TV, and there used to be a crowd. The people who were there in person, their event experience is totally different to what you're experiencing on TV, but it's a great experience nonetheless. It's enjoyable nonetheless. So we're trying to kind of piece that together now as we look towards 2021 and hybrid events, is what are we going to need to be considering for each of these experiences that are going to be in sync together, but totally different experiences.
No, I like that analogy of you talking about sports because there are benefits to being at the game, but then there's also benefits to being at home. You can see
Mhm.
things closer, you can watch a replay, but when you're there, you get the feeling of the food and the people around you. So I think you're right. It's going to be
Yeah.
kind of that mix as well. When it comes to safety, what are the industry partners doing, such as airlines, hotels, and so forth? And what types of precautions do you see the travel and events industry taking?
Yeah. The hotel and airline industry is, I don't know if you've been on an airplane or stayed at a hotel since all this happened, but it's slowly getting back to business. And from what I can see, they're extremely conscious of their responsibility that they're holding, especially hotels when they're hosting large groups of people at their venues. And I mean, this is a $1 billion industry, right? They rely on events and business travel for their success. So they've been hit really hard since this pandemic has started. And actually, I was watching a webinar that shared that in March, only 6% of trips that were planned for March actually happened. And it's been a slow pickup to get back to business travel since then. I think it was something like 98% of companies either stopped, canceled all travel, or postponed. So, I mean, I know for Ingram Micro, we're still in the process of trying to, figuring out when we're going to get back to business travel, or, even adding in essential business travel. It's a big responsibility for corporations, and that includes that hotel and airline industry and the travel industry. That is such a huge integral part of the meeting and events industry. So I think we can continue to see them making every accommodation necessary to ensure that their customers feel safe when they're traveling or staying. I know I get a ton of emails from every hotel brand and airline constantly updating on how they're accommodating to follow CDC guidelines and keep customers safe. And they have really thick pocketbook plans explaining every last detail of the accommodations that they're making. But it's going to be, I think, after Q1 of next year that we start to see business travel hopefully start to pick back up. But again, this is just one of those things that it's really hard to predict.
Now, when you think about the next year in your industry, where do you see the technology within the events industry going?
The technology industry for events has already been really interesting to watch. When it comes to even things like the Zoom boom or Microsoft Teams making huge changes to their platform to accommodate for virtual meetings. When this all first happened, Teams was, I would say, half of what it is today in terms of what it was able to do, Microsoft Teams. So I think that the next big challenge is really going to be addressing these hybrid events. I know for me, I'm going to be keeping a close eye out for technology companies coming out with new products that make streaming live content really simple, because I'm not very techy, but really professional looking. So I want that software that we can have at an event, whether large or small, that's going to make it really, really streamlined and simple for the user to get that content that's happening live onto a virtual platform at the same time. I think also phone applications are going to be a huge change that we're going to see. We're going to see what we were seeing before was apps for events. And they were used sometimes, not all the time, but they're used pretty frequently. If you attended a large event, there would typically be an app. But I think what we're also going to see, in addition to the basic features on those apps, are things like location-based risk notifications, interactive security maps, contactless check-in. They're going to be using technology that's already existing, and they're going to be continuing to advance that to add in and account for security, health and safety, and certainly these CDC guidelines. Notifications, reminders of things like, push notifications saying wear your mask, stuff like that. And then lastly, the virtual and digital conference software is out where, in my opinion, have a lot of work to do in improving their platforms. So I think there's space for us to continue to see these platforms evolve, and there's plenty of room for more competition. So I'm excited to see what comes of it. I have my eye on Silicon Valley to see what they're coming out with. I know there's even companies now that will do the entire CDC guideline process for events. There's just so many new businesses popping up through this pandemic, which is, great to see in a time that's, I know, is difficult for so many.
Now, if people want to learn more about all the events that Ingram hosts, or they want to learn more about anything we talked about, where is the best place to do that, to ask any questions they may have?
Go ahead and connect with me on LinkedIn, Allie Ashdown, or reach out to your account manager at Ingram Micro to learn more, and they can also put me in touch with you.
Well, thank you so much, Allie, for sharing your insight, and congratulations to you and your team for all the great work that you've been able to do over these past few months. And I look forward to hearing more about the events that you offer soon.
Thanks so much, Keri.
If you like this episode or have a question, join the discussion on Twitter at Ingram TechSoul with the hashtag B2B Tech Talk. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro.
You've been listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, hosted by Keri Roberts. This episode was sponsored by Ingram Micro's Imagine Next. B2B Tech Talk is a joint production with Sweetfish Media and Ingram Micro. Ingram Micro production handled by Laura Burton and Christine Fan. To not miss an episode, subscribe today on your favorite podcast platform.